Hello, everybody. Welcome. So we're going to talk about crop planning for seed production. My name is Sebastian Aguilar. I have Chickadee Farm down in Talent, Oregon. It's 3.5 hours south of here. And Daniel Brisebois is from Quebec. He's got ferme Tourne-Sol. And we kind of have, so we took the same subject. I focus mostly on wholesale. Daniel does both wholesale and retail, and we're just going to talk about how we set goals and then how we move on from there to get to the point where we have a crop plan. So also want to just make sure we thank our sponsors for helping us put this together, supporting Organic Seed Alliance and helping make this happen. All right. So I'll just tell you about my farm real quick. We've got 20 acres on which we grow maybe 4 acres of crops. We grow exclusively seed crops, mostly vegetables, some flour. We did maybe 40 lots of different things. We sell to seed companies who then packet it up and retail it. As you can see, we're up in the mountains. We have a nice fertile valley. That was the crew this past year. We've got my wife Kelly in the middle, and then Jeff and Ramses helped us through the season. So we're a real small crew, pretty small operation, and I like it that way. Keeps it simple. I'll let Daniel introduce his farm.
So I'm part of la ferme coopérative Tourne-Sol Cooperative Farm. Tourne-Sol is French for sunflower, and it's also a play on words meaning turn the soil. We are 12 people that run this operation. There's 7, so we're a worker co-op, and there's 7 of us are co-op members, and we have 5 employees. And about, maybe 2/3 of them work year-round at this point. We're west of Montreal in Les Cèdres, Quebec, so about 45 minutes west of Montreal. Here's our farm. And we have our farm is about 17 acres, and on that is about just shy of 13 acres that are tilled. And we have just above 7 acres that are in cash crop any one year, and about 5 acres that are 6 acres almost that are in cover crop. And so off of all of that, we're growing about almost an acre of seed crops. We're also vegetable producers. We do about 425 weekly CSA baskets, and we also do a farmer's market. So this is like the big part of our operation, and seed's about a quarter of our operation at this point. And the whole farm is growing in general, but seed is probably growing at 20 to 30% a year, sometimes even 40 or 50% in a year, whereas the vegetables is growing a lot slower, and we're kind of happy with it that way. Now, of the seeds that we sell on our farm, about 70% are produced on farm. About 10% are produced kind of by growers in our area, contract growers, and then the rest is produced in other regions, sometimes from other seed growers that we know, and a little bits from wholesale. And so I thought I would go through a couple seed crops just so you have an idea what our scale is. And then we'll jump into the crop planning piece, which is why we're all here. So this is tomatoes. The level we're at now is we use kind of a millet wet seeder, squish everything, it goes through, it screens it. We ferment stuff in big garbage cans, and then we decant it, and there's a lot of seed on the bottom. Spread it out on screens, and we have kind of a forced air dryer to try to dry it pretty quickly. And so that's what we're doing with tomatoes these days. And then like a dry seed crop, like a brassica, like Mizuna, goes to flour. We thresh it around this point, or we harvest at this point. So we live in a fairly wet climate as opposed to some of the dry summers that might be out here. So we can't dry things in the field as much as we'd like. So we spread things on tarps, bring them into the greenhouse, and we let them after ripen there. And then we'll bring things out. And most of our technology for threshing is stomping. But we also have this soil shredder. It's kind of like a wood chipper that we've modified to DC current, and just can control the speed a little bit more. And so we can do a lot of threshing with that too. Then we have our high-tech screens, and we do some winnowing. So a lot of manual technology. And then we wound up with a bunch of seed in bins. And then we pack it up and sell it. And so that's what brings us here is the crop planning of how to get to this point. And so the first question to ask is, what is crop planning? And so you're figuring out what to grow, how much to grow, and when to plant. This is to meet your goals before the season begins. And these two last lines, to meet your goals and before the season begins, are very important. If you do it after the season begins, we call that crisis management. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with that. Some of you might already know that I have written a book on crop planning for organic vegetable growers. So some of the stuff that I'll be talking about is referenced in that, but it's also a little bit of a different approach than we've done in the book. So if it's different, don't be afraid. And so the basic process that both of us will talk about is start off by setting goals, and then you develop a marketing plan to meet those goals, and then you fit a crop plan that's going to meet your marketing plan. And once you're starting to put it in action, you want to keep records to keep monitoring it. And so what's important here is that you're starting with the end process. You now know where you're going to get to, and then everything that you're doing is to get to that point. And so what are your goals? And so why do you want to farm? And more specifically, why do you want to grow seeds? So you might love working in great outdoor weather, and that's why you want to be on a farm. You love the physical nature of it, and you can be active outside. You want to be in touch with your food and part of the food system. Maybe biodiversity is important, and you want to be preserving different varieties that might be lost otherwise, or creating new varieties that might not exist otherwise. You want to be part of an agroecological system that has a lot of flowering plants out there, and seeds are great for that. Feeding all kinds of insects and helping creating habitat. So all of these are reasons why we choose to farm. And from a holistic management perspective, we call all of that their quality of life goal. And this is really why we do it. But there's also money. and so the next chunk, I'm going to address more the financial part, but I do want to make sure that it's clear that this is in a concept that the money is not why we farm. The money is the means at which we can achieve what we want to do. And if you're lacking that money, it puts a lot of stress on all your relationships, and it can make it tough on your farm, and it can make it tough to survive. So you have to know how this fits in. So often, you have a farm, you make $60,000, you spend $50,000 on all kinds of expenses, you wind up with $10,000 in your pocket. I call it a salary here, you call it your profit, call it what you wish. That's what you get. And so that's a lot of work. You can have another farm, you sell $20,000, you spend $10,000, you wind up with $10,000 in your pocket. In the end, both of these farms, you have the same profit. One of these is probably a little more stressful than the other one. And now, it's not that we want to make $10,000. Often you want to make more than $10,000. But if you're not aiming for where you want to go, you're going to just spend all the money that comes in. I mean, maybe not all of you, but some of you will. And so it's just important to know what the priority are. So the priority is not growing seed or vegetables or whatever your operation is. The priority is not supporting all your suppliers, though they're very appreciative of all the work you do. The priority is that you need to be able to make a living and be able to meet your quality of life goals. So to that you really have to start with how much do you want to make. So this first scenario is kind of like a newer farm. You want to make $11,000 in your pocket. So next you figure out what farm income is going to do that. And a good early benchmark is half your profit. Half your income should be profit. So you can double that number. And now what you have left is your expenses. So I'm sure there's a lot of math whizzes in there. But if you wind up with about $11,000 as expenses. And so you need to make a budget so that you only spending $11,000, and you need to follow that budget. And that's sometimes easier said than done, but it's the first part. The other part is another way to make sure you keep that money is make sure you have a separate bank account for your personal life than your farm business, and transfer money over. Even if you are the owner, you could kind of treat it like a salary. If it's $11,000, you could call that $1,000 a month or $500 every 2 weeks, transferring the money from one account to the other. Because sometimes you just have all that money sitting in one account, that farm account, it's just easy to spend it. Whatever you do with your personal life expenses, that's separate from this workshop. But but just making sure that it's clear that you need to keep some of that. And then same process down the line. If you want to make $30,000, try to keep that be at least 50% of your gross income. And so you have about $30,000 for expenses. Now, over time, you start to have a better idea what your expenses are, and you can figure out closer what a sane business is for you. And maybe it's only you're capturing 30 or 40% of your income. Maybe you're capturing 70 or 80%. Those are really great numbers. But knowing what you have to keep in your pocket is really important, because otherwise you won't be farming down the line. And a couple guidelines, and these are guidelines that I use for vegetables. I think they're a little bit transferable to seeds. So a new farmer can often make about $5,000 to $10,000 gross sales per person working in the field, full-time in the season. A lot of top farmers can make about $40,000 gross sales per person working in the field. And what's interesting, this is about per person. It's not about space. So you might have half an acre and you're making $200,000 off of it. It's phenomenal, but you might need to have 5 people to do that. Whereas if you're making the same $200,000 off of 10 acres, it still might take 5 people. So we're seeing more and more models where people are generating more revenue per small acreage, but still you need a certain amount of labor to do the job. And to convert from veg to seed, it's better to think of this in terms of like bulk seed that you might be selling wholesale to a seed company, rather than thinking about it in terms of a direct market operation, which has a lot more work that goes into that. And I'll talk more about that after. Am I handing to you?
Oh.
Yeah. So, Sebastian.
Perfect. Daniel did a great job. And since we're talking more or less about the same thing, I'm going to end up repeating a little bit of what he said. But, you know, so what are my goals when I'm thinking about my farm season? Obviously, one of the first things I want is just a smooth season. You know, you want it to go easy. You want to minimize stress. Farming can be stressful in the first place. So if you have a solid plan, you know, in the middle of the season, you just can focus on the work. You know what you need to do. You know when you need to do it. If you don't have that plan going into it, then, you know, you're going to be standing there in the middle of the field in July wondering, okay, well, what's next? What should I do? Da, 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 when really you should just be working and making a plan happen. So a smooth season is a really valuable thing, and having a plan makes that happen. You know, obviously the other thing we're trying to do is minimize risk. There's a lot of risk in farming. You know, so if you have that plan, if you've thought through all the different steps, if you've thought through all the potential things that can go wrong, if you've built in some buffers, if you've done all of these things in your head and on paper before you get the season going, then, you know, you're going to minimize your risk. And then, as Daniel was saying, you know, if you're not profitable, then you don't get to do it again the next year. And, you know, all those reasons why you are farming don't get to manifest. So, you know, same thing as what Daniel said. We start off with a goal of, well, how much money do we live on? How much money do we need to pay rent, to buy food? I've had 3 teenagers for the last few years. They're pretty darn expensive. So we start off with our income goal, and part of doing that equation of, you know, the income I'm going to get plus the expenses is the sales target I need to hit, is you have to know what is my capacity, you know, because if you want to make $50,000-$60,000 and you've got to sell 120, if you do the 2 times ratio, do you have that capacity? You know, and obviously the newer the farm you are, the smaller the farm you are, that's going to be harder to know and harder to achieve. So, and as Daniel was saying, you have to know your expenses, and a lot of that comes with experience. You know, there are a lot of resources out on the internet of enterprise budgets. What are the costs of production? Unfortunately, for small scale and organic growers, there's not a lot of information for them. You know, most of it's all commodity crops, large scale. You know, when it comes to seed crops, when it comes to small scale, it's really hard to find that information, but it's starting to slowly become available. And you know, and then that's why conferences like this, where you can talk to people and kind of get some ideas. I agree with Daniel in my experience that 50% for our scale of farm is right. You can use that to get started if you don't have your own experience. And one thing we're going to emphasize later is just keeping records, because those records that you keep of what you did in the years past, that's going to fuel all of your decision making into the future. And so if you don't have those records, you're just going to be shooting yourself in the foot and regretting it because you're like, oh, well, I should know this and I don't. So if we talk about knowing your capacity a little bit more, there's different ways you can think about it. Obviously, one is how many acres can I take care of? How many pounds of crops can I grow? How much labor do I have access to? How much labor do I need? What's my infrastructure like? What kind of tools and equipment do I have? What kind of irrigation system do I have? Basically, how efficient can I be in the tasks that I need to accomplish? And then, you can have great labor and great infrastructure, but if you don't have good systems, it doesn't really all work out. So you've got to think through, how do I actually get my production done? How do I manage this farm? How do I get from A to B? So then capacity is not just a volume thing, but when it comes to seed growing, what's my capacity for growing certain species? And then of certain species, how many varieties of that species can I grow? And for me, being a wholesale seed grower, I'm not getting that retail dollar, and so I need to make sure that whatever species I grow do well commercially in my area. So there's a lot of crops that I could grow that maybe don't produce all that much seed, and if I was just growing for my farm, or if I was maybe growing for direct market, it would still make sense to grow that crop. But if I'm selling 50 to 100 to 200 pounds of that crop, it doesn't make sense in my climate because, it's either too hot or too cold or whatever. Every crop has its own specific needs. Isolation, if you only have one field, you're only able to grow one variety of a lot of species. Obviously you can have another field 1 to 3 miles away, depending on the geography and topography, and maybe grow more. Otherwise, crops like tomatoes, you want to have 100 feet in between them. So, we've got where we do most of our production is a 12-acre field, and it's maybe 800 feet by, 500 feet, more or less. And instead of having nice long rows going any one direction, that would be really easy with a tractor, we've got it broken up into these little 100 by 100-foot plots, and there's 24 of them within that 12 acres. And what that allows me to do is grow 24 varieties of tomato and still maintain that 100-foot spacing. Whereas if I had a long row, then maybe I could only get 8 varieties of tomatoes in there. And so you can see we grow in these blocks, which that's one variety, that's one lot of tomato. Obviously, it'd be simpler to just do that all in one long line, but then that impacts the amount of isolations I have on my property. And so we've kind of stuck with the block method for now. Same thing goes for pest and disease. Maybe you have the right climate, but you have a certain pest, you have a certain disease that impacts that crop in particular. And so, especially when you're selling seed to other people, obviously seed-borne diseases are the most impactful that you don't want to be spreading around, but then really any disease, any crop that's just difficult to grow is going to be harder to make money at. And if that's part of your goal, then you have to take that into account. And then obviously there's crops that would be easy to grow. They love the climate, there's no pest and disease, but they require special equipment in the cleaning or harvesting process. And so there again, we're limited by the tools we have, and sometimes we're approached, oh, can you grow this species or that species? And I'm like, well, I'm not really sure what I would do after I grew it. It's not worth it to, hand pick anything. Otherwise I start losing money really fast. So those are my thoughts on capacity. So I'm going to jump into marketing. Like I said, we do strictly contract production, which basically means every spring or, mostly January, I get on the phone with seed buyers from several seed companies. We have some conversations. I tell them the isolations I have. I tell them what I would like. They tell me what they need. They tell me, they give me some options. And through those negotiations, we come up with some contracts, and then that's what I grow for the year. So, I talk to them in the spring. I'll update them a few times over the season, and then the hope is that I can send them the contracted amount of seed in the fall, or most likely late November to early January, depending on how on top we are. Thanksgiving is always our goal, and so far I've yet to hit it. So as we're evaluating all of these offers, we're looking for risk, and it's kind of all those things that I mentioned. How easy or hard is this crop, and essentially how risky or not is that crop. Other things I'm thinking about is, does it use our capacity? So, let's say, let's take a brassica species. I can grow some Oleracées, let's say it's Toscano kale. If one company offers me a 50-pound contract for that, and another company offers me a 300-pound contract for that, if I feel like I have the capacity to do the 300-pound contract, it makes much more sense for me to do that than to take the 50-pound contract, right? So you're always trying to maximize that capacity that you already have, especially when you only have one isolation. So, and that's why the coordination and the timing of all those conversations with seed companies is kind of important for you. So, if somebody offers you a contract that doesn't maximize your capacity, how do you hold off until you've made sure with everybody else that they don't have something that is better suited to your scale and needs? A lot of time as a contract grower, we're faced with new varieties that we've never grown before. It's something new that they want to carry. They saw it in their trial gardens. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. How did it, the amount of information I'm able to get is usually pretty limited. And so, luckily I was a fresh market grower for a while, so we've seen a lot of germplasm in the past, but there's still always new things, and new things are always a risk, and especially in seed production. Even if it's good at production maybe for fresh market, there's no way of really knowing is it a good seed producer. So, you're looking for that. You're looking for, is there any funny things about it? We were just talking about French breakfast radish. I've never grown it personally, but I've seen it on a couple of farms, and I've grown other radishes, and the French breakfast always looks a little bit different. It sticks out of the ground. The base always rots. It's just kind of like a weak plant in the flowering stage, seed production stage. And so, those kinds of things can really impact you. Disease-free. You want to sell disease-free seed. Everybody wants to buy disease-free seed. So you want to make sure you're not importing diseases into your farm. We're getting more and more in the habit of asking all of our customers to test their seed before sending it to us, so that we're not importing something that we can then no longer get rid of. And then obviously yield potential and price is huge. Is this going to fit into our marketing plan, our sales goal? And yield is a difficult subject because it's all over the board, even within one species. And so that's just where experience, conversation, and then risk management is important. So if you don't know, then don't do too much of it, because if it is a low yielder, then you'll be regretting it. And then obviously, does it fit into the overall farm plan? Does it fit into your labor? You want to balance out your labor, so you want to have your overwintering crops and harvest those, and then you want to have your early summer crops and then your late summer crops. You don't want to just grow tomatoes and then have the most insane September ever. At least not on a small farm with limited labor. And maybe you do. Maybe you'd rather just, be alone or with a couple people all season long, and then you've got access to large crews, and it makes sense to do that. It all just depends on where you live and how the agriculture is in that area. But how does it fit into the overall farm system is what you want to think about. So Daniel's going to touch on his marketing.
All right. So one of the big differences that between what Sebastian's talking about, what I'm talking about, is that I'm also going to kind of tackle more of a retail component, like selling seeds directly to people, as opposed to companies who are also people, I guess. A lot of good people in them. So your marketing plan needs to have, what your sales outlets are, the crops that you're going to grow, the prices you're hoping to get, what your sales projections are, and then turning those sales projections into harvest projections. So I'm starting off with that 60,000 that this hypothetical people that we introduced earlier are trying to make. And now these people have a market garden, and we're not going to talk about that much today, but trying to make about 32,000 off of it. And then they've broken the rest of the revenue they're trying to make into 2,000 for whole seed, 16,000 from an online store, and $10,000 from a seed rack. And so this is not prescriptive. This is just, an example. And so I'm going to go through what some of these bottom parts are and how you would look at that from a marketing perspective. So we'll start off with the packet sales, and just to distinguish, small packets probably aimed at gardeners as opposed to larger packets that might, or larger formats that might be aimed at farmers. And you can have an online store where folks click what they want. You get an order, you fill it, and then you ship it to them. Easy peasy. Or you can also have a rack program where you have racks that go to a store. They're full of seeds. People either buy them flat out, or maybe there's a consignment basis. Different kinds of systems are possible. What's nice about a rack is that whereas with this, people might order $10 of seeds, might order $200 of seeds. With a rack, if you have 48 varieties on it, 10 packs on it, it can easily come to $500,000, $1,500 sale. So there's an interest in that part. So you got to convert the number of packet sales you're trying to make into harvest targets. And so start off by how many packets does that mean? So if you're trying to make $16,000 sales off of a web store, and if you're charging $4 a packet, and that number is chosen because it's round, it makes it easy. So it's 4,000 packs that you need to sell to make that. And then for a seed rack, if you're trying to make about $10,000, and if maybe you're making $2 per pack, you need to make 5,000 packs. So that's 9,000 packs that you need to be producing, these generic packs. And so next is allocate those packs to a number of varieties. And so here, Cherokee Purple Tomato, you're aiming to sell 100 through your online store, 200 through your rack means you're aiming to sell 300 packets of tomato seed, or that tomato seed. Think about how much year supply you want to produce in any one year. And it's good to have a safety factor. That can accommodate a number of things. It can accommodate, losing some seed by mysterious ways, but also, your sales might increase over time, and it's nice to have more seed than you need. It's possible you're also aiming for a 3-year supply, but you sell out quicker than 3 years. You need to know how much seed is going to each pack. We look at it in grams. In a Canadian context, we tend to work metric. So 0.2 grams in a packet gives a certain number of target kilograms. So it's just the math on the bottom. 100 packets plus 200 packets is 300 packets a year times 3 years times a 1.3 safety factor. So it's 30% more than you need. At 0.2 grams per packet means you need about 230 grams. And you can convert that, and that's about 0.51, about half a pound. So half a pound of seed would mean you could sell about 300 packs a year for 3 years. You can do that for a number of different varieties, all the varieties you want to do, and make sure the total packets come up to what you're looking for. I mean, you probably want to do a little bit more than what you're going to need, because you might not sell everything. These numbers are in the proceedings, though there was one mistake converting from kilograms to pounds, but other than that, it doesn't really matter. But here's the accurate numbers. And so this is kind of looking at packets, so you're figuring out how many packets you need and turning packets into weight of what you need to be harvesting to distribute that. And one thing you can look at is, the Cherokee Purple Tomato, you need 300 packets. It's half the provider bean, but one case it's half a pound, the other 70 pounds that you need to meet that. So, and so the weight of how much seed you're putting into a packet really has an impact on how much seed you're going to need. And that actually looks like a high number, but yeah. Then you can also be growing seed on contract, like Sebastian was talking about. And in this case, it's a little bit simpler in that, you have a price per pound that you're going to make, target pounds that you're trying to sell, and that gives you a certain dollar value. And so this is all negotiated with the seed contract. So whereas the packet sales, you can hope what you're going to sell, but you don't actually know until you've sold it. Whereas here, you have a contract right off the bat, Now it's just a matter of growing it. And there's always a little bit of uncertainty in that, I'm sure. And next, you want to combine your harvest targets. So what your retail, so your packet sales and your wholesale targets wind up being how many pounds you need to meet all of those. And then this is going to be the beginning of what your crop plan is. So you know what you need to harvest. So now it's about figuring out how to grow that amount. And so this brings us to the crop plan. And so when we're going to plan our crops, we want to know how much we need to grow and when we need to grow it, where we're going to grow it, and then a question of who's going to do the work. So start off planning for space. And I've included some yield projections based on average crops on our farm. And as Sebastian mentioned, yield is a big unknown. And there's different sources you can find for yields. Like John Nevesio's book, I think, has some yields in there. Knott's, vegetable growers. You can find different stuff online. We have a fantastic list here. And it's not going to be accurate, but it's better than nothing. So it's a good place to start. And down the line, what's going to be important is keeping track of your yields and starting to learn how they fluctuate. And some of the things that make a difference are your bioregion, you know, your soil, the rain, you have a longer season or shorter season, but it's also when you harvest. It's possible a peak period where you're getting 100 pounds off of something, but if you had harvested 1 week earlier or 1 week later, you might get only half or 2/3 of it. So some of it has to do with your skill. And then there's a great diversity in varieties. And I mean, you think between a cherry tomato and a full-size tomato, there's probably a lot more seed in that cherry tomato, but then not all cherry tomatoes are equal either. And so those are all variables that are good to learn. And there's no absolute reference. And so it's over time, you got to learn the feel of that. And so the more you're growing crops and specific varieties that you already know, the more you're going to feel comfortable with it and more reliable with it. But with that disclaimer, these are fantastic numbers to use. So next up is how much area do you want to plant? Or need to plant, not do you want to, do you need to plant? And so knowing how many pounds you have, and yeah, so just here, I've kind of had a column that's the pounds per acre, and then I've converted that also into pounds per 100-foot bed. And there might be, you know, 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows, depending on the crop, but that full bed, how much seed yield will come off of it. So with your target pounds, you can multiply by a safety factor, and here I've tossed in 1.2. So you want to grow more seed than you're expecting that you need to sell, because all kinds of things can happen in the field, independent of variability of weather. You know, you might have groundhogs or deer or something that come in and they take a little bit off. So you need to plant more. But if you plant twice as much as you need, and you only sell like half of it, you know, it's twice as much labor and other expenses. So you got to be careful how much more you do. In this case, I'm aiming for about 1.2. That's probably on the more conservative side, but if you do a lot more than that, it's maybe too expensive. So if you're aiming for 2.5 pounds of Cherokee purple tomato times the 1.2 safety factor divided by 2.3 pounds per 100-foot bed means you need about 1.3 100-foot beds. So in this example, you need 1.3 100-foot beds, about 12 beds for fighter bean, and then 1.3 beds for Mizuna. You probably round it up a little bit. You don't want to be just doing a 0.3 bed unless you have something else that can fit into it nicely. And so you know how much space you need for all the crops that you're doing. And you should pay attention to whether you have space in your field to do that. And if you don't, you probably want to be looking at the crops that are a little bit more profitable than the crops that are less profitable. So next up is when to plant. And now this also, my recommendations probably are meaningless to most of you guys. We're in Quebec. It's a very cold winter. We've got a couple feet of snow right now. What I can say, and so what our reality is much closer to probably the Northeast US. And so we kind of look at 3 groups of crops. The frost-sensitive crops, these are ones that can take low levels of frost, or just freeze a little bit and survive. And so we're aiming to get those in the ground first week of May or so, because by then there's no snow, at least in our area, and most of the ground is pretty much drained, so we can work the soil and plant into a good seed bed. And one of the things with seed crops versus veg is that seed's in a lot longer than veg, so you want to be have a good bed prep, because otherwise you have a lot of weed problems, and you don't want to have to struggle with that all year. So frost-sensitive crops, first week of May, and then tender crops like tomatoes, peppers, things that can't tolerate the frost. We're probably targeting around 1st of June. In our area, we have very low risk of frost at that point, and the soil's warm, and so the risk of frost is definitely a game. Like, it's a game changer if things die in one night from one day to the other. That's not good. But the warm soils is even more important, because you want your crops to go in and just take off. Unless you're breeding for growing in cold soil, you want to just give your crops the best advantage on everything. And then the last group is biennials. So for us, we're probably starting biennials sometime between mid-July to mid-August. And we can't really overwinter things in the field, so we got to dig it up, bring it into a cold room, or grow things under tunnels to protect them from the cold. So that's kind of the broad categories of when to plant. And so we've talked about when and how much, and what we're not going to talk about is what we do before then. So once you know those numbers, you can actually figure out what to start in the greenhouse and when to start in the greenhouse, and figure out how many trays. And there's some really great resources out there, but I'm going to focus more on the seed part. So we won't go into this right now. Next up is where you're putting those crops, and so we'll talk about the maps and rotation. So this is our field, and we've got a lot of crops in here. And the two magenta, purplish blocks, those are our main seed crops. In the middle is most of our vegetables, and then we have a little bit of secondary beds on the sides. And so it's about 1,300 feet from one end to the other, about 700 feet wide. And so for a lot of crops that are outcrossing, we find that so it's probably about 1,500 on the diagonal between those two areas. We find with 1,500 feet, we can grow 2 brassica arepas and not see crossing between them. Now, we're probably growing about 1/10 of an acre. Maybe if we were growing 2 acres, that might be too close, and our neighbors aren't growing seed crops. So for most crops, we're able to have those 2 isolations, and it works well. For crops that are selfers and don't need as much isolation distance, that's why we also toss in those blue blocks, just to have more stuff. And then we have the veg in the middle. And the veg is, for the most part, not a problem. Like, mesclun, salad greens, we'll till in before they go to flower, so they don't cross up with our stuff. But the whole cucurbit family is more problematic. So that's all your squash, cucumber, melons. Because we're market growers, those are crops that we grow a lot of, and we grow a lot of diversity in species and diversity in varieties. So we have a really hard time placing cucurbits into these areas. So we have another field in the middle of one of our neighbors' organic field. We grow our cucurbits there. So in the middle, sometimes it's sunflowers, sometimes it's corn or soybeans, and then we have a little parcel that we've worked out, and we have to drive through a forest of other plants to get to. And so that's how we manage that. So for crop rotation, we look at when things are planted rather than just the families, and really breaking up the frost-sensitive crops and the tender crops. So the frost-sensitive crops you can plant early, and the tender crops you can plant late. But it's basically, they're different groups of families. So the frost-sensitive crops, a lot of brassicas, peas, lettuces, some other stuff. And then the tender crops is the solanaceae, cucurbits, beans, and some other stuff. There is the peas and beans, in the same family. Sometimes there's asters that can go in either of them, but most of the crops are different. And that's how we guide our crop rotation. So one year we'll have an early crop, and then the next year we have a cover crop. And we use a cover crop. One of the side effects of having a seed crop is that you can't harvest all the seed, and stuff shatters on the ground, and that becomes a weed crop for the next year. And so rather than struggling with that, we just have a cover crop to flush out whatever weed seed we can, and then the following year we'll go into a new cash crop, so it'll be a tender crop, and then go back to cover crop. Is that clear? So this breakdown? No one looks too confused? So just what that might look like in the field. So in 2018, we have 4 blocks, and blocks 1 and 2 are in crops, late and early, and then the other half is in cover crops. And then the next year, we'll swap what's in cover crop and what's in cash crop, and then we'll come back to what's in cover, come back to cash crop, but we're switching the early and the late. So you can see they're not following each other immediately, then to cover crops, and then we switch again. And so you can see the late crops only come back 1 year in 4. And for most disease problem, that's adequate. So there's a quick question about what cover crops do we use. We use all kinds of cover crops, and the cover crop isn't as important as just not cropping, you know. So I would say one thing is after a seed crop, I tend to not want to till the soil. I want to leave whatever shatter seeds on the surface for the winter. You could broadcast a cover crop if you want, but having the seed on the surface means it's going to germinate, and that'll flush out a lot of stuff. It's also predated on by mice and beetles, so they get a lot of that stuff out. So the next year we'll see the cover crop, and we're not burying seed. And so it's probably like oats and peas if it's early. You know, the cover crop mix isn't as important as breaking the cycles. And then the last piece is planning for labor. And this conversation really changes whether you're just doing wholesale for the seed companies, or you're actually doing packet sales. Because in one scenario, you're probably working over a peak labor in August, September, October, harvesting and cleaning. In the other, you're working over a peak period of probably August to May, and where you're packing up and selling. And so it really, in the first scenario, you probably want to design your business so that you're able to keep the same amount of people busy for a long period of time, unless you can hire a bit of labor, as Sebastian was mentioning, at some peak moments. But usually it's hard to find good labor at the last minute. So just being able to design your business so you use the same amount of people for the full season, that's good. Whereas packet sales, you're going to try to keep them throughout the winter. Yeah, and I won't talk too much more about labor than that. And that brings us to you.
All right. Well, once again, it's going to mimic Daniel's again. So, you know, what are the elements of our crop plan? It's obviously, you know, what crops and varieties that we're growing, how much are we growing of each of them, when am I planting them, where are they going, you know, and then you can take another step too and make yourself a tillage calendar, you know. So I need to get into that field 8 weeks before planting, 4 weeks before planting. If you know what your cover crop is going to be like, if you know what the climate's going to be like, you can try to anticipate how long it's going to be ready to get to a planting condition. You know, you can, it's good to vary the fertility that you're giving to each crop. Some crops needs more, some needs less. So, you know, once you have that map of where things are going, you can create a fertility map so you know where and how much to apply whatever amendments you're using. And then it's also just good to go all the way, and instead of just planning out the crops that you're growing, you know, go ahead and plan out the cover crops that you're going to do as well. And so you've got dates on the calendar after brassica harvest where, you know, you want to get a target cover crop in. And maybe you've already picked out your variety, and so then you have the seed so that when that time comes, you're just ready to go and you're not scrambling for seed and waiting for it to get to you. So early is always nice, you know, with seed crops, because they do take a long time, and you want to make sure not only that you're able to harvest in good weather, but a lot of times, you know, you're not just harvesting instantly, you're cutting and swathing, letting things ripen up a little bit. And then, you know, the situation we find on our farm is that we're not always as efficient as we'd like in the threshing and cleaning process. So sometimes, you know, we'll cut and swath something and then it'll have to sit there just a little bit longer than it needs to. And so, you know, if that's happening closer to the end of the season when there's rain coming, that's a much riskier situation than if you're able to harvest it a little bit earlier and you've still got a window of nice weather coming up. On the other side of things, you don't want to fight the earliness. You know, you're not rushing to market. You don't want to, we're not trying to be the first ones to market with carrots and, you know, pushing that envelope. There's no real advantage to us going in too early, because when you go in too early, you're going to till when it's too wet. You're going to fight more weeds than you need to. The crops are going to grow a little bit slower. So, you know, you want to just strike that balance. So when is it the right time to go in? And just make sure that you're going in as soon as it is the right time and not before. You know, as for how much to plant, once again, this just all goes back to yield data. And, you know, like Daniel was saying, you just over time, the more and more you grow, the more your data set grows. And so the better you understand the range, the better you understand each species and varieties. And obviously, if you can get into a situation where you're growing the same variety consistently, that's going to make things a lot easier, because that's easy to predict. Like Daniel, we always add a buffer. You know, if I go back through my records and I look at what I anticipated getting and then what I actually got, and I average that over the whole farm, usually it's around 85%. So, you know, 15% failure rate was common for us for quite a while. And so adding that 10 to 20% buffer kind of ensures that, you know, you'll come closer to getting what you're hoping you're going to get. And then in terms of crop rotation and where things are going to go, you know, I mean, this is the same for any farm. You know, there's not too many things that are different about seed production except maybe the isolation and the irrigation. But, you know, obviously you have to think about your soils, which are the fields you can get in early, which are the ones that stay wet a little bit longer. You want to follow all the basic principles of crop rotation for disease and pest management, you know, heavy feeders, light feeders, etc. But then isolation, you know, Daniel had the great map of how he's spreading things around the field, and I described how, you know, maybe for tomatoes that need a minimum amount of isolation, we can try to spread those out. And then irrigation, you know, especially if you're doing mixed crops, you know, including seed production and a fresh veg farm, you know, if you're overhead sprinkling certain crops, you obviously can't grow those next to your seed crops. You know, these guys don't want to have a sprinkler on them. And depending on how tight everything is, you know, I know a lot of farmers have struggled with that. And I struggled with that in the beginning of knowing how to place everything. And it's not even the crops that you're producing, but it's, let's say it's the cover crops that you want to get in. You know, sometimes you're not able to get a cover crop in right next to your seed crop until it's done. So just thinking about that ahead of time. And so, like I said earlier, record keeping is what makes all of this possible. And you need to, the more information you have, all of this is making a plan based on information. So you got to have the information, and you're the best source of that information. So obviously, all the essentials that you need to keep is what are you harvesting and how much did you plant. You know, if you don't have that, then you're really missing out on some key information. The other are all your planting and harvest dates. You know, subtract one from the other, you get days to maturity. That's a key piece of information to have. You know, you always make a map logging where everything went. Obviously, if you're certified organic, you know, you're having to do all of this anyways. But even if you're not, I would highly recommend doing all of this. But then, you know, start taking notes about other things like pest and disease pressure. When did you see a problem? You know, how common is this problem? Is it showing up every year? Did you manage it? Were you able to manage it? You know, if you have a problem and it gets out of hand on you, you know, make sure you take a note of it. And then the next year, a month before you had that problem, start scouting your field and looking for that same problem. Because most problems, if you find them when they're just starting, you can manage them, you know. It's when they get a little more developed that it becomes unmanageable. And then obviously just reflections on your whole system. You know, how did the season go? What were my bottlenecks? How efficient was this process? You know, really every single day that I'm out on the farm and I'm doing a task, I'm asking myself, is there a better way to be doing this? You know, how would I do this again the next time? You know, and I think that's an essential piece of always improving your farm, because, you know, farming is a tough business. And so if you're not always tweaking it the best you can, then it's going to be hard to succeed. And so obviously record keeping is a habit, and you just have to get into the habit, and it obviously makes it a lot easier if you have a good system and plan of how you're going to keep your records. So ever since I've got a phone with a camera, one of the easiest ways is I just take pictures of everything. So, you know, sometimes I'll even, because when you take a picture, it's got the date stamp on it, right? So sometimes I'll be out in the field planting, I'll just take a picture of the seed packet, I'll take a picture of the area where I'm planting, and that took me, you know, 5 seconds. And I've got a permanent record in my computer where, you know, it's got the date stamp, it's got the variety, it's got the seed source, it's got everything. Obviously, that's not enough. I still have to, at a regular interval, go in and enter that into a spreadsheet, you know, and make it yeah, just finish that process. But that's been a nice, easy way for me. I also send myself a lot of texts. And, you know, I'm not a very good typer, so I just talk everything into my phone and send it to myself, and I've got little notes, and then, you know, it's just a matter of assembling all of those notes later on. But just getting into those habits of trying to track as much as you can, you know, and obviously, you know, and I'm not just trying to track all of these basics, we're also trying to, if you were here on Wednesday, we're trying to track now how much labor we're putting into everything. Not every day, not every task, but, you know, doing some time studies, trying to find where are we doing well and where are we not doing well in terms of efficiency, and how does that reflect on the overall farm profitability.
So I'll talk about more on record keeping. So there's three pieces that I'm going to talk about in addition to all the other records you can keep. Kind of your harvest logs, your post-harvest logs, and then your sales records. So for a seed harvest log, we have clipboards with paper on it, or, you know, printed out chart that has, you know, what's the SKU, or the code that of the crop that we're dealing with, the lot number that's been assigned to it, what the crop is, the location in the field, the date that we're harvesting, what weight we might harvest if it's relevant. So something like tomatoes, we like to know how many tomatoes we harvested at that point, the whole fruit. Whereas if we're pulling bean plants, we don't really care what the whole pile of bean plant weighs. And then it's flipped when we ended and when we started. Usually, I guess it used to be flipped around. But and then how many people did the task? So it's a bit of, we can figure out how much time it took to do something. But this is how we keep track of the harvest logs. And so it's recorded on paper, but every couple of days we try to get it into the computer because it gives us a good glimpse of where we're at. And then we have post-harvest logs. So you can see these bins of seed have this little sheet beside it. And on that sheet, again, it has the SKU, it has the crop. I didn't write it down, but it should have the lot number too. And then the harvest date, so we can correlate with the previous log. Any date we might thresh it. If there's something that makes sense to weigh, we might have a threshed weight. And then we also have later on that tag will travel with the seed until it gets cleaned, and then we'll have the date it was cleaned, and then also what the weight is. And we can write notes on that if we wish. We don't tend to, but we could write what screens or other things that we did with it. And then this, when it gets into the seed office, we try to get this information as soon as possible into the computer. Sometimes it's not as soon as we'd like, but once we have it into the computer, we're able to see it. We use Google Sheets, so everybody's able to see it, so we kind of have an idea where it's at, even if it's not germ tested yet. And so these two pieces of this log and this log give us a lot of information for the future of for planning purposes, and also where we're at currently. And it's easier to record stuff in paper rather than taking out a phone or a tablet in the field. But once it's into digitally, then it can be shared with everybody. So we're trying to move more towards tablets. We got a new one this year to have in the greenhouse, at least for threshing, maybe not in the field. But it's something that extra step of transferring from paper to digital is one place that things can disappear, and you might have just a pile somewhere of information that's not being accessed. So the other really important information is what you've sold. And so, you know, with the bookkeeping software, if you invoice people, you know, you can have you should record things by variety and with the weight. And also if you have a SKU, keep that there. If you have a web store, if you're going through Shopify or WooCommerce or somewhere else, and you're invoicing, that can also create a report of what you've sold and when. And so what's important is you have to invoice everything. So if you sell seed to anybody, if it's a small sale, a couple packets, or if it's a large sale, get it into your system, because that's how you know that you sold it. And that's when we're going back to that first step of looking at income. This is information that can show you what's potential. And then with this information, your sales records, you can figure out how much seed you sold per outlet. Yeah. So, so the question you're asking is, and so I would just clarify before I answer your questions that when I'm talking about invoicing, it's more the sales that you're doing rather than the receiving. But the question you're talking about is more on the receiving end. So if you receive seed from a seed contractor, you get it into your system. And your question is, do you also do that for seed you produce yourself? And We do, but not in our software. We have another set of spreadsheets that we record all of that. What we actually get into the computer or into the online store is what has been packed up and is ready for sale. But we do have a whole other inventory of what we've received, and we assign a dollar value for what we produced ourselves. Yeah. But this is really on the sales part, not so much the expense part. We don't for packets, but we do for, like, if we're growing seed on contract for somebody, we have, or if we're selling large amounts, we'll have a lot of information associated with that. But small packets, we don't. But each packet have a lot number on it. Does have a lot number on it. So if they have a problem, they can contact us with that lot number. I'll go through the next couple slides because we're almost wrapped up, and we've got about half an hour for questions. So we'll try to keep questions more in that period. But stuff that you're going to learn from your sales records is how much seed, either packets or weight, did you sell per your different outlets? And also, how much seed did you sell per month, which can help you in some of your budgeting. So this is the sales records piece that you're looking for. And so this information that you're getting, this data is what really guides your crop planning in the future. So with this kind of information, like this sheet here and this sheet here, if you know how many bed feet you grew and what you harvested totally, you can figure out what your yield is. And then with your sales, you can figure out what's feasible in different sales outlets. So this is, in your first year doing a crop plan and a marketing plan, you're just making numbers up. But over time, so it looks like a linear process of setting your goals, and you develop your marketing plan, and you plan your crops. And it is within 1 year. But over time, at the end, your results of this is what sets your next goals. And as you get a better understanding of what your crop plan is, your crop plan starts to set what some of your goals or marketing plan can be, because you can realize, as Sebastian was talking about, different field layout and what you might want to be able to grow. If you could grow 24 tomatoes, then you're probably going to try to figure out how to sell 24 tomatoes. So those pieces all start to fit together as your system matures. But at the base, you have to know where you're going. And if you know where you're going, then you're a lot more likely to get there. So I'm just going to mention that there's a lot of Canadians out here. And in general, in the world, there are Canadians and all kinds of people from everywhere. But I mean, at this conference, there's a big Canadian contingent, and a large part of that is because the About a Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security, which is doing a lot of fantastic work across Canada. And so I would say thank you for listening to me so far. And if you want to stay in touch with me on our farm, we're on all the great social media out there. And hand it to you also.
Thank you. So yeah, we left a lot of time. We've got almost half an hour for questions and answers. We were hoping you guys would have some. So
your question is, if we're growing a new crop for seed that we haven't grown before, where do we find information about isolation requirements and maybe yield and other stuff? I think the first thing to know is make sure you know what species it is. So and that might be a stupid statement, but sometimes things might be the same species and you don't realize it. So knowing the species is the first part. The internet is one source. There's a couple other books. I mean, you probably should have in your library. There's what's it called? John Nevasia's book, Organic Seed Grower. There's Susan Ashworth's Seed to Seed. There's the newer book, The Seed Garden. There's NOFA New York put out a book about 15 years ago called, what was it called? Does anybody know what NOFA New York book was called? Anyway, it's a small book. I think they have it through Amazon. You can still get it now. So there's a number of sources like this. So they'll all have isolation information. Some of them have yield. Having multiple sources is a good place to look at. There's also a book that's available through that Patrick Steiner published from Stellar Seeds up in BC called, Small Scale Organic Seed Production. Thank you, Chris. And so that's available. You can find it as a PDF, I think, through the what's the website? Through bcseeds.org. So there's a lot of really great information that's already there. Talking to other seed growers is also a really great place. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, isolation isn't a hard and fast thing either. So it's interesting to, read about the discussions around when do you need more, when do you need less. So, I know John goes through that in his book. And then maybe somebody here knows there's the guy who did the Mid-Atlantic resources on seed saving and production. He's got a great little booklet he put together on isolation. Jeff McCormick. Yeah. So his stuff's, yeah.
And kind of on that, the fact that it varies, I think ultimately you are your best resource of information resource. And so I mentioned that we do about 1,500 feet isolation distance on like Brassica rapas and Gentias. And we hit that isolation distance pretty quickly because we're also salad growers. So, you grow up, harvest a bunch of seed in August, and then you sow it every week for the next 5 weeks, and you can see 10,000 seedlings, and you can tell if it's crossed or not. And we've definitely learned the hard way that the 200-300 feet is not enough. And so some crops you gain a lot of trust quickly with. So something like arugula or any of those that you seed a lot. Something like a squash, it took us about 4 or 5 years to really feel comfortable with our squash seed because you harvest it, you're not growing it until the next year. And then if you're growing it, if you grow 100 plants, that's a huge amount for a lot of us. So if you're only growing 10 or 20 plants, you might not see crossing. So it takes a while to really gain that confidence. And so if you don't trust your seed, it's really hard to sell your seed to somebody who wants to buy a lot of it. And so it's something that you need to gain experience. And the more you can work with the same varieties, the better. And if there's a new variety coming in, I wouldn't recommend growing a lot of it. Like we've done some contracts on stuff that was the same species, but a different variety, and then we'd get like a quarter of the yield. And if it's not 4 times the price, it was a bad choice. So I think you had your hand up, and then there's another hand thereafter. So your question is, you're doing market sales and you're doing seed sales, and you're growing from the same beds. So you might have a lettuce bed, and then some of your lettuce you're going to let bolt, and then the others you're going to harvest. You're going to let the best ones go to seed, and you're going to sell the worst to your market. And so you're wondering how to do record keeping in that context of your sales. Yeah. I think, so your record keeping, what you're looking at is not the packets that come out of a bed, you're looking at the weight that comes out of a bed. And so I think of another variable is, let's say it's different, so you're just doing market veg and you had bunched carrots and you also did bulk carrots by weight, and they're coming out of the same bed. How do you keep track of that? And you can record a couple different things in this. In the case of the carrots, it's clear because they're both carrots, like physical carrots. And you could just say that one bunch of carrots is equal to like, a pound, and you can do a conversion to get down to it. You don't have, it's not as simple as that with the seed. So I think, but what you could do is, what's a bit of a nightmare, but what you can do is, I mean, so in terms of keeping track, you just basically want to know where it's coming from, what you harvested, and then you can assign a dollar value if you want, and you can figure out what a total dollar value is for that you produced out of that bed. And I would produce it on a bulk level. So if I was doing, let's say it was beans, and or let's say it's lettuce, okay, and you're producing, and you get a pound of lettuce that comes out of that, or let's say a quarter pound, I wouldn't consider that quarter pound is 100 packets. I would just put a quarter pound price on that. So maybe that's something like 20, 40, 50 bucks, depending what your yield is like and the variety. And then so you assign that dollar value to it, and you figure out, and then you can also figure out how much it's coming out of in terms of your lettuce heads. So you can get a total dollar out of that. In terms of planning the next year, really you need to know how many plants that went to seed. So you could also figure out, as opposed to looking at it in terms of bed foot, let's say you have a 100-foot bed with 300 lettuces in it, 3 rows, what fun is 300 rows. And I don't know how you choose what is going to go to seed, but let's say you let 40 plants go to seed, rather than you might want to, in your record keeping, consider that, so that 40 plants, or let's say it was 39 plants, that's 13 bed feet, and then you have 87 bed feet, that's the rest. and so kind of figure out, separate that way. So kind of just quantify that piece of information of how many plants you let to go to seed. We'll leave the rest be assigned to the market value. Would that make sense? Yeah. It is. We've actually moved away from having the beds in the same place, because what in this lettuce case. So if you had 300 lettuce, so if you had a bed of 300 lettuces, how many would you keep for seed? So 150, so half of it. So what this strikes me is this is a seed crop which you're selling the rogues. And so for me, what I'd be more interested in knowing is how much seed weight I got out of that bed. The dollar value of the rogues is interesting, but that's not what I'd be planning around in the future. It's really the seed crop that I'd be looking at. It might be different in a case where you might be doing tomatoes, and so it might be a vegetable crop that you're trying to get a certain amount of seed on, but then I wouldn't be surprised if most of your harvest is going into vegetable. And in the case of tomatoes, so this is actually where it gets good, but it's easier. In the case of tomatoes, you weigh how much you harvested as fruit before you squish it. And that's something that we like knowing that number, because if you know, so it's nice to know in this context where you had, let's say you harvested 100 pounds for market veg and 50 pounds for seed, you know, got 150 pounds total, and you can consider that for your yield. But also, let's say you did 50 pounds for seed, and then you harvested 2 pounds, and I'm not sure if this is a good ratio or not, 2 pounds of seed out of that, then what you'll probably find for that variety, and that's the important part, that proportion of 2 pounds of seed for 50 pounds of fruit is probably fairly constant. And so that if you need to get a total of 5 pounds for a contract, then you know that you're going to need 250 pounds of tomatoes to do that. So in that case, it's a lot easier if you're keeping track of the poundage. Okay. Repeat the question.
Oh, repeat the question. Disease management. How do you know what to look for? How do you test what's there? What's kind of standard operating practice around that? So yeah, I look in John Navazio's book. In the back, he's got a great section on common seed-borne diseases. That's obviously the one those are the ones we're most concerned about. You know, not every part of the country has the same disease pressures. So you want to know in your region, what are the diseases you need to worry about. Once you know those, you know, not every disease is testable. Many of them are. And so, you know, and then, you know, the scariest ones are the ones that you're going to bring in on a seed lot, and then they're going to spread to everything else, or they're going to get stuck in your soil for a long term. So those are the ones you want to be most careful about. You know, I have taken on a lettuce from got stock seed from one company that had, you know, really high mosaic virus pressure on it, and sure enough, it spread to another lettuce, and then I couldn't sell the other lettuce. So, you know, for certain crops, we do tests. We don't personally test. We put that onus on the seed company to test their stock seed. And, you know, some companies aren't really worried about selling virus-infected seed. I mean, it all just depends on the variety and who their customer is. You know, so, you know, but we do have some customers who only want to sell virus-free seed. And so, you know, when it's really important to them, you know, they're proactive and they're already testing it. And then they're going to test our lot when they get it, you know. And I mean, that's the thing. If a company wants virus-free seed, you know, make sure you're getting virus-free stock seed, because if there's no test before and then they say, oh, well, it's virus and I'm not going to buy it, then, you know, were you screwed from the beginning? Just want to make sure that doesn't happen. So, you know, I mean, and then I guess the only other thing I can think of is a lot of the seed companies will also do some seed treatments, you know, whether that's hot water or bleach or something, you know, that can, if you've got some low pressure disease out there, you know, sometimes that can take care of it and good enough so that it's passing tests. But, you know, the tests add up. It gets to be expensive. And so the smaller the lot is, the less valuable or the less feasible that kind of testing is. You know, you need a big lot to make it worth it if you're going to spend a few $100s on it. Yeah.
Another question? So the question is, The stock. So when we're growing on contract, where does the stock seed come from? Does it come from the company that we're dealing with, or do we have to source it ourselves?
95% of the time it's from the company. Usually they have their own strain that they want you to grow. Every once in a while they don't. And I think companies are interested if you have a good strain that you've been managing or not, but it all just depends the history, if it's something new for them or not. Yeah, but most of the time, yes.
We contract from growers, and I really like when they use our seed. Sometimes there might be something, might be adding a variety that we don't have, or they want to suggest a variety, so we might do something else. But there's a certain amount of risk that goes with that if I haven't actually trialed the variety. And also, if I trial the variety and they get the variety from the same source, but then they change their source initially, then we might not actually be growing the same thing we tried. So we feel a lot safer having that control. And I think one exception is if the grower is stewarding a variety that they're going to keep stewarding in the future, then it's just once I've trialed it once, I know that variety works. I mean, I might keep trying to make sure it's staying the same, but that'd be a different kind of situation that we run then. So your question has to do with how we recorded labor, and do we have individuals record their own labor, and we trust that they're actually doing it accurately, or do we have somebody else recording their labor? And I think there's an assumption there that we're recording everyone's labor, and we actually we don't record everyone's labor systematically. I think where we look a lot is key jobs, especially harvest, what makes a difference, and we look at bottlenecks, and we might keep track of how long it takes to do a certain thing that we think is a problem, and then try to optimize it. It's not a seed case, but for a while, maybe 1/6 of our sales were garlic. So a couple of years, we kept track of everything having to do with garlic, because it was if we can make a difference there, it would have the biggest impact on our business. And one thing we learned there was that when we were harvesting, half the time of harvest was actually hanging the garlic up. It was something we wouldn't have known had we not tracked that labor. And so therefore we had a clear place to make a change. And so we chose that because it was a big crop that we made a lot of money off of, and we want to make sure we weren't spending a lot of money doing it. And so we've done similar with tomatoes. In seeds, because we're growing, we do have a few big seed crops, but there's nothing that's even like 10% of our revenue. So we're kind of look at it as a bigger piece than if we just had 10 seed crops going on contract. Maybe like you guys, maybe have more than 10 seed crops, but we might pay more attention to each step. But here it's more trying to highlight where the bottlenecks are, and then maybe use time as one way to analyze it. Do you want to answer that question?
Well, I think there's two ways to look at it too. I mean, there's all the activities that are non-crop specific, so bed preparation, maybe weeding, irrigation, so you can just do a time study on that, time yourself X amount of times, take the average, and then more or less that's going to be what it is for every crop. And then there's the crop specific time studies. So how long did it take me to, cut and swath this particular crop or thresh that particular crop? And yeah, I mean, we're a small operation, so usually it's me thinking about it and doing the timing. I'll definitely ask my crew, oh, will you time yourself for this? And then, get their feedback and log it. Yeah.
Mary Claude, would you like to add something? Oh.
Hi, I actually I'm an employee at the Tourne-Sol Cooperative Farm. Yeah, I coordinate harvests and cleaning. So even though I'm an employee, to me it's really important to know how much time it's going to take me to harvest and to clean, because that's how I plan my work during the week and during the day. So even if I don't have somebody watching over my shoulder and making sure I track the time it takes me to do certain tasks, it's just, I think it's part of my responsibilities as an employee. I want to make sure I plan my work efficiently. So yeah.
I think one thing that makes record keeping easier is if if the staff knows the value of it, and if you can show places that record keeping in the past has revolutionized the business, they'll be more willing to play the game. And if it's just data keeping to keep data, it's less fun for everybody. And so you have to use it to show value. So there's a few hands that got up. I don't know who's had the hands longest, but I think Chris, you had your hand up for a bit. Or no, okay. There's a hand right here. Oh yes, you're. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of things that come into it, and it's not just scale. It's also the. Oh, so you're right. The question is, how does? Thank you. What is the difference of growing on contract on a large scale? You might be growing hundreds of pounds versus growing a smaller amount for a company that's selling a smaller amount, like like 10 pounds versus 200 pounds. And price is probably a big difference that goes into it. But price isn't only on scale. Some of it might be what kind of markets that seed company is competing within. And so a company that's competing on a national or international level, they're competing with seed companies everywhere. And there's a seed supply of certain varieties that are very common that might be dirt cheap. So you might be buying arugula, you might be able to buy arugula, I don't know, $20 a pound in a seed catalog. We can't produce arugula at $20 a pound. It's probably being grown on larger acreage. Maybe it's mechanized. I'm not sure. Same thing. Look at something like a Market More cucumber. Might be able to get for $30, $40 a pound, and there's a lot of that out there on the market. But if you look at a really specialty variety that might have a comparable seed yield, but it's only a couple seed catalogs that are carrying it, and if they're growing it themselves, you might have a cucumber that's $80, $90, $120 a pound, and so. So for myself, as a small company that's mainly focused in a bioregion, we might sell a Market More cucumber at the same price as a specialty cucumber, so kind of higher, because we're not competing with the same players that might be on an international level. And so we need a certain price to make sure it's worthwhile for us. We also need to have a certain price so it's worthwhile for the person that we're buying it from. Because if we're buying from small growers, they can't afford to have no price, and then we won't have them down the line. But it means that our clients it has to be important for them that it's being grown in their bioregion, and therefore they're willing to pay a higher amount for a variety that might be similar to something they can get in another catalog for cheaper. And that similarity might just be name, because if it's something that we're selecting in our conditions, even though it has that same name, it might be more adapted because it's selected our conditions. We hope it's not worse, but it should be better. And that's the whole idea of why we're selecting seeds in a certain climate and selling seeds in those climate, as opposed to maybe sourcing seeds from somewhere else and then reselling them. Do you have anything you want to add on that?
I mean, I think we're still on the small side of things. I think. I mean, I'll just take lettuce for an example. So every once in a while, I'll get $100 a pound for lettuce, if it's a small order from a small company. If it's a medium-sized order from a larger company, it's more like $65 a pound. I've grown lettuce for $45 a pound before, and then I talk to growers who are bigger than me, and they're getting, $15 to $20 a pound. So there's just all kinds of different levels, and it's just, it depends who your customer is. And then obviously wherever you're at in terms of your farm capacity, you're going to be targeting those specific customers. For me, I can't sell lettuce at $20 a pound. And so I don't try to, but yeah. But then I also can't sell enough $100 a pound lettuce to fill my needs, so that's why I'm growing more lettuce for less.
So we still have 3 or 4 minutes. We can look at a few questions. There was a question down here. So the question is that in our presentations, we've showed isolation in terms of time, and maybe it's in terms of space a little bit, but not in terms of infrastructure like caging or hand pollination. So have we considered doing those things? And you also, or is the option there? And then also, if we wanted to do F1s or hybrids. So isolation in time or space is way easier than anything else. So that's why we prioritize it. And the growers that we're working with, I think that makes more sense in general. If there were specific varieties that we could only get if in those cases, we'd probably be interested in that, but it's going to have a higher price, so I probably avoid that. In the case of F1s, we just sell OPs, even though we use a lot of F1s in our market garden. We only sell OPs in our seed company, and we haven't gone into any kind of F1 production ourselves, so we haven't been taking contracts on like that. We take the contracts we take on are stuff that we know we can grow easily and grow well and always get success.
Yeah, I mean, and to go through the time and effort and cost of creating, you know, isolation tunnels and things like that, it doesn't pan out for us most of the time. So, you know, maybe we'll do it for a breeding project or something else like that, but yeah, not usually.
Yeah, I mean, one variant on that, I would say, like for us, we have a really hard time getting great carrot seed, and we have some more greenhouse space now, so we're hoping to try to grow some carrot in that case. If we grew carrots in a greenhouse in Quebec, we know we can sell all of that in packets, and so where there's an added value for it, I don't know that we would get the price per pound that we'd want for those unless we had something really exceptional. But if you're just growing a couple beds, you're probably not getting something really exceptional. Like you're not bringing new varieties there. Yeah, so the buyer's not sentimental. And I think that one of the differences is that we sell seed to about a dozen different seed companies, and some of them are the largest. So in that range, some of them are larger, some of them are smaller. And I think some of the smaller seed companies that we sell to that do sell specifically in Quebec or Ontario or the Northeast US, they might be interested in paying a much higher range for carrots in those cases. And so, but we only can sell so many pounds there. It's not the same. That's not, we can sell like 500 pounds at a great price. And we don't have the greenhouse space for it either. Maybe one more question. I think Mojave, hand up there.
Well, so the question is, when I mentioned picking the 200-pound lot over a 50-pound lot, why wouldn't it combine the two? Well, generally in that situation, we're not talking about the same variety. But I think you're right that if you have that opportunity, you know, especially if it's a common variety, you know, sometimes when we grow on contract, that company kind of wants some exclusivity for it. You know, they put a lot of work into the stock seed and whatnot. And so you definitely want to ask permission to say, do you mind, you ordered 10 pounds, can I grow an extra 5 and sell it to, you know, X, Y, and Z? And I think if you can do that, obviously that's good for you because that's efficient. You know, it's more efficient to grow one block of something than to grow 10 different things, you know, that total the same thing. It's less management.
So you want to be, so you're on the flip side. So as opposed to the grower kind of trying to line up different contracts together, this is the case where the contractor would line up different companies to get a big enough company or big enough contract to make it worthwhile for the grower, and maybe also negotiate a better price because they can get 100 pounds because they're 5 people rather than getting 60 pounds. So that's the flip side of it. So Sebastian and I are going to be here the next 2 days, and we love talking about seeds. So you're welcome to come and chat with us at any point. And and then there's a million other questions. And maybe just summing up before saying a final thank you is, you know, the big thing when you're making a plan is you got to know where your goal is. I've kind of stated it. Sebastian's also stated it. And it's, if you don't highlight what your goal is, financial or otherwise, you're a lot less likely to hit it. There's not just money flying around, and you know, so really you have to plan for where you want to get as clear a vision, and that's when all the other stuff can fall into place because you'll know what you're trying to support. So make sure you got that goal before you get the plan, and then go for the plan. But thank you very much.
Thank you.